I got into teaching is to see smiling faces in my classroom. So it would be a huge help to me. All right, so welcome. We are now recording. Before we get started here, I have somebody I want to introduce to you. Zaire, are you on?
Yes, I am.
Okay, go ahead. Take it away.
All right. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Zaire Goins, and I'm a junior in a double major in psychology and political science. I'll be your tutor for this semester. My times have already been posted. They're every Wednesday, 3 to 4 p.m. We are also offering individual tutoring. If you would like to have a tutor outside those hours, you can email me, zgoins@live.esu.edu, or the tutoring center, which is tutoring@esu.edu. This Saturday, I will send out a link for my personal ID for Zoom. I know that this semester can be tough at times. I understand that completely. Professors, the tutoring department, and myself are here to help with your needs, more so pertaining to the academic side. My tutoring philosophy is pretty simple. The goal is for you to come in with a question and have you leave with an answer. I strongly believe that it's best to be proactive and not reactive. If you need extra help or just want to be prepared for any upcoming anything, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you, and I hope all of you have a great semester.
All right. Thank you, Zaire. One thing to note, Zaire, he is like you said, a psychology student. So what would you say a percentage of your classes involve APA format in your assignments?
That'd be pretty sure a good amount, probably like 75%. It depends on the professor if he wants to give out papers or not.
Okay. Part of my, I feel part of my job is to get psychology students ready for those classes. And by default, what I do is I introduce APA format within your assignments. We've talked about it at some length. I do have some resources available. If for whatever reason you feel like you're struggling and you're just not finding enough resources that I'm giving you, connect with Zaire or anybody else in the tutoring center, and they'll help you out with getting your paper squared away. So far, it looks like I haven't really seen a whole lot that I'm concerned about as far as the assignments you're turning in. They look pretty good. We have a little bit more work. I'm going to be getting some feedback to those of you that need a little bit more assistance. But again, tutoring center is certainly available to help you out with those obstacles. Okay. So thank you, Zaire.
No problem.
So before we get started, just a couple service announcements. So Monday, I will be available for a short period of time to answer questions. I won't be having a lecture. So if you want to show up and you need maybe a little bit of one-on-one guidance or something, I'll be available for that on Monday. Unfortunately, I have another engagement that I have to take part in on Monday, so I won't be able to stick around very long. So we'll resume our lecture. I do have a lecture on week 3, on chapter 3 for Wednesday, so we'll resume our lecture on Wednesday. All right. All right. So as far as Packback goes, it looks like I think we're getting closer. I still see some people that have not gotten a Packback account. I did reach out to Jen. Jen, you're on here today, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I reached out to Jen if I saw that your name was not on the Packback list, so that way she can connect with you and see what kind of assistance you need getting that set up. Okay. So, but for the most part, I'm looking at the questions that you're posting and the responses, and they all look really good. The only thing I do want to bring up, and I don't know as though this is necessarily a big issue with our class, is try and keep your questions pertaining to whatever the topic of the week is. So for example, this week would be biological perspectives, dealing with the brain, dealing with neurons, neurotransmitters, those sort of things. So any questions you develop should be in that area. So next week will be sensation and perception. So try and keep your questions confined to that area. I'm not super picky as far, like for example, if you talked about sight or hearing or something this week, That's okay. It really does deal with the biological perspective. So that really does fit within the sphere of what we're talking about. So, but do your best. The only thing I would really advise against is asking classroom questions like, how does APA work, for example? Please don't do that in Packback, because that would probably be moderated and taken off, and you'd have to do it again. So I'm trying to think what else I have for you. Assignments are looking good. Packback's looking good. Seems like most of you are doing your quizzes. For this Sunday, please don't forget, on top of your assignment number 2 that you have, which is a Dropbox, so you don't have to respond to another student's posting this week. You'll also have a diagnostic that's going to help me determine what group you're going to be put into. So please, please, please get your diagnostics in. If I don't get your diagnostic, I'm assuming that you don't want to partake in the group, which means that you would probably you'd be accepting nothing more than a C for this course. All right, any questions on anything up to this point? Okay, and I'll have some time at the end of the class if you have any questions, or if you want to put them in the chat room. Jen will moderate the chat room for me today. All right, so this week I was kind of hoping to have a little bit more time on Wednesday to go over some of these topics with the biological perspective. Unfortunately, technology happens, life happens, and I was not able to get anywhere to help or to do my lecture. So I'm going to kind of touch upon some of the more important points that we're going to see echoed throughout this semester within my course. So the biological perspective in psychology is the idea of neuroscience contributing to our behaviors and our thoughts and our ability to learn and form and recall memories. Okay, so that's why we kind of look at it. Now within psychology, we're more about the mental process than we are about the neuroscience of it. And there's a reason for that, because neuroscientists deal with something completely different. Like if there's some kind of dysfunction with learning, or being able to form memories, or being able to control your emotions, we might look at the actual hard wiring known as neurons within our brains for the causes for that. So that's very important to remember. And when we do see behaviors, we have to consider all possibilities. Is it a learned behavior? Is it a biological behavior? Is it something that's not being met as far as neurotransmitters, which we'll talk about here shortly. Okay, so to that end, let's take a look at the very basic building block of the human brain, which is called the neuron. I'm going to share my screen with you here. Now, for some reason, my screen has been freezing. So if that happens, if I'm talking about something and it looks like I'm drawing and it's not coming up, just let me know. So this is it. This is the neuron. And this is a pretty good, accurate adaptation or depiction of what a neuron looks like. So at the beginning of this process, you have dendrites, okay? These dendrites are like little tentacles that connect to other neurons, or pain receptors, or taste receptors, or anything really. So what happens with these neurons? They connect at certain points, as you can see here. Now, let's say, for example, let's use an example of putting, I think we used this last week, of placing a pin on top of your finger. When you put a pin on top of your finger and barely touch it, you're activating certain receptors within your finger. And they could be pressure sensors, they could be tear sensors, or pain receptors. Depending on what is being activated, these dendrites will send a signal saying, hey, something's happening here. Now, the more you push, the more receptors are going to be activated, saying, again, sending more signals to your brain, saying something more is going on here, and it's getting, we're feeling more pressure. Maybe if you break the skin, you'll have those tear receptors activated, and that sends like an alarm to your brain saying, hey, something's happening, our body is getting damaged. And then based on your instinct, you know to retract your from whatever source that is causing your pain, right? So how that happens initially is one of these more of these dendrites are activated, which then talks to the soma or the nucleus, and at a certain point, the nucleus says, "Hey, we need to send a signal," and it does. It fires a signal down what's called the axon. All right. So this axon is nothing more than just a wire. And if you think in terms of computer, you have wires running all over the place that carry electrons, right? So it's carrying this pulse. Your axon is carrying this pulse to the end of the receptors, which then activate other dendrites. Now this happens thousands of times for one sensor. So one thing going touching the tip of your finger is activating 1,000 times throughout your body to get to your brain, up your spine and into your brain. Okay. So if you notice, by the way, if you notice around the axon, you have this fatty tissue known as myelin sheath. Now this sheath is kind of a conductor, or not a conductor, a insulator, and it protects that wiring from really crossing any other wires. And if you think about that in terms of computers or electronics, you have an insulation on the wires themselves, right? Because what happens if you have two bare wires touch each other? They short out, don't they? So it's important that some of your functions are resistant to any kind of interference, because they're important. They might be an important function for our brain, and we don't want any kind of misfiring going on. Okay. So I put that up. I put this picture up here because it really shows. It's a good depiction of what a neuron looks like. So this is more of a diagram look at it. So again, here are your dendrites, your soma or your cell body, and it sends a signal. Now your book it talks about potassium and sodium and positives and negatives. Just know that these are this is a chemical reaction that occurs. So when this neuron fires a pulse through here, these swap. So your negative go on the outside, your positive go on the inside, and that just makes a good conductor for that pulse to be carried through the neuron. And then it goes to the synaptic bulb or synaptic knob. All right. And I'll show you what happens when we get to here. But before, let me talk about action potential first. So your soma, again, your soma is kind of the boss of the entire neuron cell, and it tells the rest of the dendrites, how many signals are we going to accept before we fire. And if we hit a threshold, we're going to fire that signal out. Now, it's important to keep in mind that our neurons don't have, I guess, a level, if you will. It's really all or nothing. It fires something or it doesn't fire something. So how can that be? So if we push harder, pin harder into our finger, why does it hurt more? It's not because that we're feeling a higher intensity of an action of a neuron. What we're feeling is more and more neurons firing. And the more neurons firing, it really projects the intensity within our brains. It tells our brains that, hey, we have something major happening here. So the more neurons you have firing helps explain the intensity, okay? But what happens within the neurons is the soma has its threshold. So let's say, for example, maybe on your arm, maybe not on your finger, you take a pencil and you just hover your pencil above your arm. Now, some of you, if you're anything like me, you might have a lot of arm hair, right? So the closer you get, you might trip one of those arm hairs, right? At that point, within my follicle, I have a threshold, and it's firing. It's hitting that threshold, and it's firing a neuron to my brain saying, hey, we have a arm hair that's tripped. if for whatever reason, maybe I don't have a strong receptor in like right now, if I'm doing that and I bump a hair, I'm not necessarily feeling it. For whatever reason, I'm not hitting that threshold and nothing's being fired and my brain's not being activated to say, hey, we have something going on here, okay? So after it's fired, it doesn't stay firing. It fires and then we go back to hyperpolarization or resting potential and prepares for firing again, all right? All right, so in the synaptic bulb or synaptic knob, whichever you want to call it, I've heard it called both. For some, I don't like this, for some reason, it should be showing down here, not in the middle. So this is at the end of the neuron. Oops. And what happens at the end is it connects to other dendrites of other neurons. So you have this neuron, and then it connects to another neuron just like that, or maybe a little bit different neuron, okay? So what occurs where it connects to, there's a little bit of a gap called a synaptic gap. Now, this is really important to understand, especially when we get into psychopharmacology, when we talk about neurotransmitters, because this is where these areas are implicated in mental health disorders and addiction, and even just energy level for the most part. So this synapse is a little gap, and when we have an activation, we have that action potential released. It tells these vesicles, which contain neurotransmitters, to release. So they move down to the end of the synaptic bulb or synaptic knob and release, open up and release neurotransmitters into the synaptic gap. So what happens after that? Depending, again, starting the process all over again up here, depending on what the instructions are with these receptor sites, they're either going to allow those neurotransmitters in or they're going to block them, okay? So where dysfunction occurs, and we're going to use the example of nicotine, okay? I'm not going to ask you to identify yourself, but many, or if any of you that are smokers or vapors or chew gum or have a patch or whatever, you'll be able to identify with this. Similar to caffeine. Caffeine has a very similar effect to nicotine, by the way. So what happens, and we'll use dopamine as an example here in these neurons. So what happens is nicotine or caffeine, once it's ingested in our body and gets into our bloodstream, it fills in the gap, the synaptic gap here, with whatever substance we put in there, in this case, caffeine. And it emulates dopamine. So it enters these receptor sites saying, hey, it's like an imposter, breaking into a fortress or something. So they go in here and they say, hey, we're dopamine, okay? And dopamine is, by the way, and I'll talk about this later, is our pleasure chemical. It's what rewards us. It makes us feel good. Whatever we maybe some of you work out, and when you have a good workout, you feel almost like a runner's high or something like that. That's dopamine being released into your neuronic pathways. Okay. So anyway, where was I? Okay, so dopamine enters here, and what happens is once these are satisfied, there's less of a release of vesicles for dopamine. You're not producing nearly as much dopamine, or at least they're not being released because they don't need to be. You're being activated, you're being rewarded. So what's the danger with that? Why would that be a problem if we're not producing dopamine because caffeine and nicotine, regular consumption of caffeine and nicotine are rewarding us? What are your thoughts? Why would that be a problem?
Create an addiction.
Right, you're creating a dependency, aren't you? Because now we're being rewarded by something else. We don't need to produce dopamine. So what happens when we don't have either of those stimulants, either nicotine or caffeine?
Withdrawals.
Yeah, what does withdrawal look like?
Well, less dopamine produced by the body, and there's nothing else to fill up the gap.
Right. Okay. So what are some of the symptoms of withdrawal from nicotine or caffeine?
Feeling down,
Okay. Depression, right? Not
depression,
feeling
yeah.
rewarded.
Irritability.
Irritability, right? Yeah, all these things. Or depression, right?
Yeah.
What's that?
We'll kick niggas out, bro. Yeah.
One more time. Sorry, I think it glitched out a little. All right. So anyway, what happens when we withdraw? When we take those nicotines, we go into withdrawal, and we're not being rewarded. It takes for nicotine and caffeine both. It takes almost up to 72 hours for our dopamine to start producing again and start being accepted in the receptor site. Okay. All right. Are you still with me? Making sense? Clear as mud? All right. I flipped my page here and I don't think it's, all right, I might have to stop sharing and share again. I think my screen froze. All right. All right. So within neurotransmitters, briefly on this, I think your book does a pretty good job explaining what neurotransmitters are. We have dozens of them within our system. The ones that we're mostly concerned with psychology, and you'll probably hear them come up again, are serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine, or ACH, endorphins, norepinephrine, GABA, and glutamate. So these neurotransmitters are the ones in the vesicles. These are the ones that get transmitted or transferred across from one neuron to the next. And when they're affected, it could do things like we talked about dopamine. It could do things to our mood. It can do things to our energy level. Serotonin, you may have heard of serotonin. Serotonin affects our ability to have an appetite or keep a stable mood. If we are fluctuating in serotonin levels, sometimes we might have an overabundance of serotonin, or we might have a depletion of serotonin. That could make us seem like we're having mood swings. And when we get into stress and emotion, we'll talk more about how that affects us, because that's by design. If we experience something stressful, our serotonin level goes down, right? So what happens if we're under an immense amount of stress and we're depleted in serotonin? We probably sleep less, don't we? We probably might be a little bit more irritable, or might even be depressed. We might not even be able to want to get out of bed some days. We might not want to eat, or we might overeat. So serotonin is very important in mood stabilization. Dopamine we talked about as far as our reward and pleasure. Acetylcholine is more implicated in controlling muscles and memory. Endorphins are important, like when we get into talking about sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Endorphins release within our body to help with the regulation of pain. And that's going to be important when we talk about survival, okay? Norepinephrine helps out with our alertness and arousal. GABA is helpful for our sleep and inhibiting movement. And of course, glutamate is implicated in memory and learning. All right. All right, so our nervous system is broken into two branches. And I like how your book really describes this. You've got your central nervous system, which is your brain and your spinal cord. And these are basically the carriers throughout your body. So all the connections within your brain go through your spine and branch out through those neurons that we talked about to your extremities and to your organs, okay? We're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about that, because that's more neuropsychology. But where we are going to spend a lot of time is talking about our autonomic nervous system. Now, your somatic nervous system, just really quickly, is really control of your skeletal muscles and movement, which are important, but for purposes of psychology, we do spend a lot of time in the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS, primarily in the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Now, think about, and I may have used this example with this class, what happens when you say you're walking through the woods and you encounter a bear? What happens through, what physiologically happens in your body?
You kind of tense up and get scared.
Okay, so muscle tense, right?
Adrenaline rush.
Okay, endorphins, right?
Fight or flight.
Okay, fight or flight. What does that mean? What happens like physiologically in fight or flight?
Digestion slow down.
Digestion down, right? Okay. What about heart rate? What happens to heart rate?
Your heart rate starts pumping faster.
Okay, good. What about vision and like your pupils?
They widen.
Dilate, right? What about breathing?
It becomes heavier.
Believe it or not, breathing does what when we're experiencing fear?
Slows down.
Goes down. Okay. What you might be thinking of and mistaken, and a lot of people do this, is we tend to hyperventilate when we're experiencing fear, right? And anybody that maybe experienced a panic attack, you know what I'm talking about. What that comes from is your body is lacking oxygen and it's struggling to try and get it back before you pass out. So it does that by you're kicking in your lungs and saying, hey, we need air up here. And you start hyperventilating. So all of these symptoms happen for a reason. It happens because we want to survive. I think somebody brought up fight or flight. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, but fight or flight happens because it's a survival mechanism that tells us we either need to ward off a threat or we need to get away from it. And there's a third option when we get into anxiety, is fight, flight. Does anybody know it? The other F?
Freeze?
Did you say freeze?
Yes.
Yeah, freeze, fight, flight, or freeze, right? And that happens when we don't know what the threat is. And that usually tends to manifest into panic attacks or anxiety or long-term chronic mental health issues, okay? So all these happen for a reason. Muscle tension, the reason why we tense our muscles is to get them activated to do something. We don't know if our mind is assessing what we want to do, but in the meantime, and pay attention, next time that you experience anxiety, try and pay attention to where you're carrying that muscle tension, because it's usually in our shoulders and necks, isn't it? Now, why is that? Why do you think we tense up our shoulders and our neck? For survival purposes. Any thoughts?
Is it because like if something hurts your neck, you could die easily?
To protect your head. Absolutely, 100% correct. We do that because we want to protect our head. We can't lose our head in a battle, right? Literally, game over. So that's where the muscle tension comes from, within our neck. And it causes, for people that experience anxiety, it causes muscle tension or tension headaches in your head, doesn't it? So, and this is going to be really important when we talk about stress reduction and therapies, because we can't really control a lot of these things. We can't really control our endorphins. We can't control our digestion or our heart rate, or even our pupils dilating, or our alertness. Our alertness goes up too, right? So breathing goes down because we become hypervigilant. We stop breathing in order to hear what's around us a little bit more clearer, because we need to be aware of our surroundings. We need to be aware of what could possibly harm us. So we stop breathing just so we can heighten our other senses. Our vision goes up. The feeling in our extremities become a little bit more sensitive, don't they? Endorphins. Endorphins are interesting because we need adrenaline. We need things to turbocharge our muscles and turbocharge our heart so that we can activate a little bit quicker if we need to. The other thing that endorphins do is reduces our sensitivity to pain. Why is that important in survival?
Get away.
Right, exactly. So if we're injured for whatever reason, do we have time to stop and cradle our wounds and deal with that pain? We don't. So our endorphins serve the function of helping us push through that pain so that we can get away from our threat or fight it off. Okay. But anyway, as I was beginning to say, the two areas that we look at for stress reduction are muscle tension and breathing. And when we get into emotions, I'll explain a little bit more in detail why that is. But just quickly, it's because they're the two things that we can control. We can control our muscle tension or breathing. So that's what happens when your sympathetic nervous system, your sympathetic division is activated, okay? I used to have a slide on here. So your parasympathetic does the opposite. So once we're out of danger, once we're away from that threat and it is no longer an issue, we go back to our heart rate going down, and that doesn't happen because of a lack of sympathetic division. Acetylcholine, or ACH, starts firing throughout our body to start reducing those symptoms. So our pupils are no longer dilated, our heart rate goes down, our digestion goes up, our endorphins the level of our endorphins start going down, and by default, our breathing starts picking up, right? Everything just starts normalizing, and that's because it's releasing hormones in the parasympathetic system, okay? All right, any questions or anybody want to add anything to this before we move on?
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
What does digestion have to do with anything?
What does digestion have to do with survival?
Yeah.
Well, if you think about it, and again, when we get into anxiety and stress, we're going to talk a lot more about that. Why do you think digestion goes down?
Stimulate your other senses.
Right. The whole reason for your sympathetic division is for survival. It puts us into survival mode immediately. So it tells any Star Trek fans out there? Anybody like Star Trek or Star Wars or Galaxy Quest or whatever? I don't know.
Star Wars.
Star Wars. Okay, so you probably, if you can imagine, many of you have probably seen some of the newer Star Wars or Star Trek. What happens when they go into battle and they say we need to divert power? What does it usually go to in those ships?
They prioritize it.
Right. So like warp engines, so they can get out of it, or life support, or shields, or something. Right. That's kind of what your sympathetic division does. Is it diverts the energy to the areas that need it the most. And immediately, do you need to eat? If you experience fear, is the first thing you're thinking about? Maybe I should go get a burger before I beat up this bear. Doesn't really happen that way, right? So. Digestion isn't important in those moments, and neither is pain. That's why pain is also taken away in those moments, because you can deal with those things later. Now, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. What happens if your sympathetic system is constantly activated? Like if you experience a trauma or you're going through some kind of stress that doesn't go away for days or weeks or maybe even months. Is it sustainable for your body to be in this condition for long periods?
No.
It's not, because what happens also with your sympathetic is your immune system doesn't receive as much attention as it needs to. So if your immune system goes down, what tends to happen?
You get sick.
Get sick, right? You leave yourself vulnerable to other ailments. So it's important when we get into stress and anxiety, we'll talk a lot more about that. All right, so really quickly, I was kind of hoping to have a little bit more time to talk about the structures of the brain. So I'm just going to kind of highlight some of the bigger areas. So within our brains, we have really several divisions. We have our hindbrain, we have our inner brain, and we have our outer brain, or otherwise known as our cerebral cortex, okay? So very important to note that within our inner brain and hindbrain, we have life-sustaining functions in there. And what do I mean by that? Our ability to learn, our ability to remember things, our amygdala is responsible for activating of those sympathetic systems, right? So it's usually implicated when we get angry or if we get sad. It's really a big, what am I thinking? Kind of a controller of our emotions, if you will. So anyway, all of these functions, it's important to note, are pretty much present in just about in most species on the planet, okay? So a lot of them have these inner and hind brains because these are survival functions. What separates us from the animal kingdom is the cerebral cortex, or the outer brain, okay? The outer brain, which we have separated, well, I know this one has several areas. The four big areas that will keep coming up for you in this class are the parietal lobe, which is here, mostly responsible for muscle movement, purposeful fine motor skills, happens in the parietal lobe. Occipital lobe, area responsible for spatial memory or vision, right? Temporal lobe, which is responsible for our hearing and our ability to speak. And in some, well, really a lot to do with our memory as well. And then our frontal lobe. Now, the frontal lobe, I do want to highlight because this is really what separates us from just about every other species on the planet. Primates have all of these areas: temporal lobe, parietal lobe, and occipital lobe. And to some degree, they have a frontal lobe, not nearly as developed as ours. But this is where the frontal lobe is implicated in our decision-making, in our judgment, in our morals. It's really our executive thinking and moral reasoning that happens in the frontal lobe area, okay? Now, what's interesting about the frontal lobe, by late childhood, your parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes are pretty well developed. There's not a whole lot more that's going to be developing in those areas. However, your frontal lobe continues developing until well into your 20s. Early 20s is usually when it's most developed. And even after that, it still continues to develop. So why do I bring that up? I'm sure many of you have had or heard the argument, why don't we allow 21-year-olds, people under 21 to drink? One of the theories, one of the ideas behind that is we know that chemicals, substances, nicotine, caffeine, really, prescription drugs, and especially alcohol affects neural growth. So if we have a frontal lobe that's still developing and somebody is abusing alcohol, and it's usually with abusive alcohol that is damaging these tissues as they're forming, what could happen if our judgment is lost or if our judgment is impaired while we're drinking, right? We may wind up with permanent damage before we're in our 30s. So that's one of the arguments that, why don't we allow people under 21 to drink? Now, there are a lot of countries that do allow that, right? And unfortunately, the United States is not one of those countries because we look at it more as like a path to irresponsibility, because we don't, the function behind it is we don't want substance abuse. And again, I'm not really advocating for one side or the other. I'm just letting you know what the argument is with that. Okay.
Dr. McMunn, we have a content question.
Go ahead.
So why is there a soft spot on a baby's head? Is it because the skull isn't formed yet?
Correct. Yes. So, and that's by design, because a child that if they had their skull intact, they wouldn't be able to exit the mother's womb during the birthing process. So that, yeah, it continues to form and harden. I mean, the skull is there, it's just more of a soft tissue, and it starts solidifying as the baby gets 2, 3, 4 months into growth. All right. So really, those are the big areas that I wanted to cover. Any questions or comments, or does anybody have anything to add on what we talked about? I'll get to the assignment questions here in a little bit.
What are the functions of the occipital lobe again? Like
Occipital lobe is for like visual and spatial memory. And when we talk, we'll get into the next chapter. We'll talk a little bit more about what the occipital lobe does and how it's implicated in sight and even memory. And one thing to note on the occipital lobe, people that are born or acquire or lose their hearing still use our occipital lobe. I know it says visual cortex, but when we think visual, we're thinking more spatial. And people that don't have hearing, that are deaf, they still are able to have spatial memory and spatial reasoning. Okay. All right. Anything else? Is that Spider-Man? What? What does that mean? Okay, I don't know what that is. All right. Any other questions?
So I got a lot of similar questions, so
Okay.
I'm just gonna read them out loud.
Go ahead.
So I did get a lot of questions about the diagnostic sheet for the group projects, asking where can they find it, and if that's how they can choose their groups.
Yes. Let me get into share my screen with you again. Right. Here we go. All right. So if you're looking at D2L again, go into content. We're going to spend most of our time in course home and content. Dropbox and discussions tend to be very overwhelming. I get confused when I look at them. So what you're going to do is go into content week 2 assessments, and here's where you're going to have everything due. So the diagnostic is just a Word document. You can either print it out and fill it out and then take either scan it in or take a picture and send it in, or you can send it back as a Word document. However you do it, I don't care. So once you fill that out, it'll give you 3 options. One, to either pick your own groups, the other to let me pick your group, or opt out of the group project altogether. If you opt out of the group project, please understand that you will not be able to receive anything higher than a C for this course. So very important that you are aware of that. So fill that out. Just answer the question. It doesn't have to be APA format or anything like that. So just fill it out the best you can, and that will help me to place you more successfully in one of the groups. If you pick your own group, make sure you can pick less than 5. If you have like 3 or 4 of you that want to be in the same group, just understand that I'm going to have somebody else that is not assigned to a group of 5. I'm going to have all the groups are going to have 5. Maybe one of them might have 4, but for the most part, they're going to be all filled up with 5 people. Okay.
And then just for clarification, are students still responding to 2 other posts this week on Packback?
Yes, for Packback, you're going to be asking one question. Again, please make sure that the question is pertinent to whatever topic we're covering. So this week would be biological perspective, like the brain or neurotransmitters or the sympathetic nervous system, whatever you want that we covered this week. Ask a question. Make sure you put the description and cite a source. That's for your question, okay? All 3 of those have to be present for you to get full credit, the full 6 points for asking a question. Your other 4 points are going to come from answering 2 other questions from 2 other students. And make sure you get that in by Sunday. I was a little lenient last week because I know we had some new people coming in. But from this point on, if it's not in by Sunday, it generates a report, and I'm not going to be able to, it's a lot for me to get people to try and make up that work. In fact, it's impossible. So make sure you get that in by Sunday if you want credit. Okay.
I'm assuming this is a Packback question. What would our source be when asking questions?
Most students put the book, or if you have like some of the videos I post, you can use those. If you have another source that's credible, you can use those. So it's your choice, whatever source you want to use.
And then I got a question about assignment 2. Some students don't seem to understand some of the questions. Would you mind clarifying?
Sure. So for the nature versus nurture, what you're going to do is watch the video, Nature versus Nurture, that's in resources. I guess I could have put a link in there. And just consider where the whole idea behind nature versus nurture, and I know we didn't really get into this, but the idea behind nature versus nurture is that our psychological makeup and our personalities and our emotions can be explained in either two camps, either genetics or through our environment. So pick one of your traits or some of your traits, and it might be that you're musically inclined, or you like sports, or something, or you're a Democrat or a Republican or whatever. Just pick whatever traits you want and try and explain it as, is this my environment? If so, why? Or is it genetics? If so, why? Because my parents, maybe my parents had big ears or something, and that's why I have big ears. I have big ears, so I get to joke around about stuff like that. I don't know if you can see that in the video, but my dad is not Bob Saget, so just to squelch any rumors there. I don't know why that came up last. Was that this class? Somebody said that?
Yeah, it was me.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Erica. All right. Any other questions?
Not that I have, no.
All right. Anybody out there? All right. I'll stick around for a few minutes in case any of you need to speak with me one-on-one. Other than that, thank you for your time. Good work, everybody. I'm really pleased with how this class is going. And I will see you again. I'll be available on Monday, but I won't be presenting any lectures. So if you want to talk to me about anything, you can do that. Otherwise, I'll see you back here on Wednesday. Have a great weekend, everybody.